Let's discuss one of the basic problems in history. Where the hell does our mainstream history come from? In our Western society today, once again, I'm always going to differentiate Western versus other people's histories, because not everybody on this planet has a messed up history chronology like we do. Not to say that theirs is perfect either. There's going to be problems. But from a Western perspective, our history is jacked up. So before we go into, we'll get into other stuff later, but let's look at the foundation of our history and where it comes from. Let's look at what is the grand scheme? What is the grand mind that this came from? Why do we believe in a very particular chronology versus another chronology? But why do we believe in the chronology that is spewed all over mainstream media, etc., instead of, say, some oral chronology that's given to us from some other culture? Why do we have a tendency as a society to disbelieve other people's chronologies that aren't in our Western textbooks? What is this? Why are we taught as we grow up as a Western nation, as a Western scholar or a Western historian? Why are we taught that oral traditions are bad? That people from back in the day were basically all cavemen and stupid, and they shouldn't be paid attention to? Why do we do this? Where did this come from? Why are other cultures' histories invalid compared to whatever our current structure is? Because we definitely have a very particular structure here in the West. Now, this structure, first of all, it's interesting. So we very much believe here in the West in a particular chronology. It is set up, it is essentially set in stone, so much to the point that we teach our children all the way through adulthood in academia a very specific timeline. This very specific timeline, in nowadays research, you are not allowed to touch it. So as you start to learn things here in a Western nation, what happens is we are very much, the way it is taught is in the sense that this is inalienable. This is how we know it happened for sure, because people in the past couple of 100 years have put this crap together, and you can't argue it. It's done. Don't even bother trying to question it. Even though, on the flip side, we're told, oh, we have to learn things, do archaeology, learn history, kind of, take a scientific approach to this, but never actually believe your results that comes from taking an objective approach. Because if your objective approach does not confer with the current chronology that's being taught, it has to be wrong. It's impossible. If your outcomes, this is what sucks. As you as a researcher, as you start to dig into this stuff, and as you start to make discoveries, or at the very least, you start to discover other people's discoveries, and you start to see that their discoveries make a lot of sense if you apply scientific method thinking, critical thinking, etc. to it, and you find, you're like, yeah, this is a good, whatever you run into, you're like, yeah, that's a good outcome. But then you match that up against mainstream chronology. What happens? You're told, no, that's crazy. It does not match. Right? So if you talk about the pyramids or something, and you start to study true pyramid science, you look at it, and there's a lot of questions there. But Egyptology, in the way we're taught, it's already locked down. So if you happen to discover something yourself, or if you start to see other people's evidence out there, of which there's a ton, other people's conclusions that do not match mainstream chronology when it comes to Egypt, you have to be wrong. If it does not align with mainstream chronology, you are wrong. Now, what the hell is that? That's not how we do anything. If we have evidence that goes to the contrary of any kind of thinking, it doesn't matter if it's mainstream or if it's just nothing, or if it's small stream. I don't know what mainstream and what the hell is the alternative to mainstream. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Whatever the idea you have, if you find evidence that contradicts it, you have to change your story. The chronology has to change, and it doesn't technically matter how much it changes. If you find new evidence that contradicts what's being taught, it's time to get rid of what's being taught and put in the factual evidence that we now have, so that we, of course, can be guided towards an actual outcome that isn't stupid. But that doesn't happen now, does it? No. So one of the things we suffer here, our foundational problem that we suffer here, that we will apply our critical thinking skills to, is just where the hell does our basic mainstream chronology come from? Because we have a set foundation here, don't we, in the Western world? And unfortunately, the westernized mainstream chronology is percolating everywhere. Percolating is probably not the correct word anymore. All right, this stuff is being slammed into the rest of the planet. I don't care where you are on this planet. This mainstream historical timeline is being forced on you, I guarantee, to one degree or another. To make matters worse, the people that are forcing this timeline all over this planet, they are winning. They are dominating. They are winning this information war, which means we on the side of truth are losing. And I hate losing. Who likes losing, right? But it's happening. Now, to understand how we're losing, we have to understand the core of what we're losing against. What is this foundation that is starting to take over? I mean, how can we attack it? So one of the first things, so we need to understand our enemy. So let's go there first before we start getting into anything else. I know it's all schizo. We'll get there. Hold on. All right. So what the hell does the Western based off of? I know I've said this like 12 times. I'm just going to keep repeating myself because I'm insane. It's crazy. All right. Western history is based primarily off of a timeline developed by Joseph Justus Scaliger, or Scaliger. I have no idea how his name is pronounced. I'm probably going to switch it up tons of times while I talk. So if you hear me say Scaliger or Scaliger, the same dude. I'm talking about the same dude. Now Scaliger, this dude took all of the information that he had available during his time period. His time period being, what the hell, when was this dude around? In the late 1500s. Now, Scaliger, Joseph Scaliger, this dude took all of the works that were all of a sudden appearing magically in the 14th and 15th and 16th century, and he started to combine all these miraculous books that were showing up out of nowhere, and he started to create what would become the foundation of our mainstream chronology. Now, Scaliger was born in 1540. His ass died in 1609. It should have been earlier. He didn't seem like he was a good dude. He seemed like he was a stubborn, egotistical piece of crap. I don't know. He could have been a good guy, but it does not seem like it. Now, Scaliger, he existed during the Renaissance period. Now, one of the things that you have to understand during the Renaissance period is the Renaissance period is a time in chronology where magically thousands of ancient texts suddenly start to appear. This is one of the interesting things. It probably deserves a talk on its own. Maybe we'll do some schizo babble on that later. But during the Renaissance, we find that people are miraculously discovering all these tomes of knowledge. And it's not just knowledge. In fact, it's mostly historical knowledge. So people are suddenly saying, oh, look at this tome I found from Julius Caesar. Or look at what I found over here that explains, all these other empires that we didn't have explanations for before. And they're voluminous. There's quite a lot of them. And they all appear right in this time period. This alone should have raised the eyebrows of every single historian on the planet that was buying in to the Scaligerian chronology. The fact that at least I, and not no one that I know of, we were never taught that all of these works come out of the Renaissance. All of these historical recountings suddenly appear in the Renaissance. This is a problem. This is a huge problem. You cannot tell me that magically, in the span of like 200 years, suddenly we are inundated with legit tomes of historical knowledge. That, you know, it's, oh my God, dude. Right there, we have enough ground to question everything about the Scaligerian history that we know. All right? Like, that's amazing. Why is that not pointed out to every single one of us whenever we are learning about history? Every single historical lesson that we ever learned should have began with a gigantic caveat, asterisk. Oh, by the way, all this stuff that we're about to teach you miraculously appeared during the Renaissance. Before that, nothing. You could say, oh, but we have all these other ancient texts. We have very, very few ancient texts that come before this period. There are not thousands of books. There are not even hundreds of books that come before this. And if you start showing me other stuff, you start saying, oh, but this comes before. This was written in like 100 AD. Those don't exist. There is nothing that old around here. If for no other reason that the second law of thermodynamics exists. Paper does not last that long. Okay, it just doesn't. Nobody thinks about this. Everybody thinks that these books have come to us from thousands of years ago, somehow miraculously surviving. No. These books are all relatively new. And, to make matters worse, quite a lot of them have been proven forgeries by historians throughout the years. And in fact, even during the Renaissance, when Scaliger was trying to push this garbage, even people back then were calling him out on his crap. Alright, so but we're not taught any of this. None of this is brought down to us throughout the ages. So this is a problem. This is an objective problem that we immediately have to have within mainstream Western chronology. All right. So let's dive into who the hell Scaliger was a little bit. So he was born in France, Agen, France. I don't know. I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm not French. He came originally from an Italian family. His father was Julius Caesar Scaliger, who was also apparently a scholar. Now, I don't know much about his father. I got to go look into that. But he did receive his education from his dad, and apparently he was a smart guy from a very early age. So fine, whatever. Who cares? Smart people are still liars. The way he did his formulation of the chronologies, he based his stuff off of the Julian period. Right? So his chronology was based on the stuff that was supposedly created back in the early, the BC 45 BCE, I believe, is when that was done, when the Julian crap started. Now there's problems with the Julian calendar, and there's problems the fact that we don't get into any of that. We are not going to get into that. We'll get into that later. The Julian calendar is its own ball of crap. You know, when we get into real chronology, which maybe we'll touch on a little bit later in this monologue here. The reason why that's garbage. All right, we're gonna talk about it for a sec. The Julian calendar shows up in what mainstream calls 45 BCE. Of course, Scaliger helps to create this, and then Scaliger then bases his chronology off of a dating system that was already weird within its own right, due to it not matching the year, the actual true 365-day year, etc. Dude, the calendars for the Julian calendar's messed up. The fact that the Julian calendar is messed up, and then we find ourselves with a new calendar down in, the 1500s? Yeah, the 1500s when the Gregorian calendar shows up, 1582. The Gregorian calendar then has to show up. According to mainstream, we have about 1600 years or so to where people are using a messed up calendar to where we finally go to what we use now. That's a problem, because that is a long time to have a messed up. The Julian calendar is messed up because it has its own inaccuracy, which is compounded relatively quickly over the years to where anybody could have seen the problems, which makes the Julian calendar stupid. And then, of course, they have to correct the Julian calendar with the Gregorian calendar because none of that stuff was lining up. This leads to its own set of questions, which we will deal with later. But just know that during Scaligerian times, he didn't have the current Gregorian calendar. He was basing his years and his chronology off of the Julian calendar. Why does that matter? Well, for everything I just said, right? The Julian calendar was already thrown off. It was already out of whack back then. Now, what's interesting about the Julian calendar is that, well, okay, we're not going to get into that. We'll get into that crap later. Now, Scaliger goes on ahead and he starts to compile all of these texts, all right? It's called the field of philology. Philology. All right, so he starts to go through all these quote-unquote ancient texts. These are the texts which are considered ancient at the time, of course, but these are the texts that people were miraculously finding in their basements. Yes. Also, as a side note, not really a side note, during this time, during the Renaissance, it was actually starting to come into, it was like a fad to buy ancient texts. So if people are willing to buy ancient texts, that means that that's a market for ancient texts, which means that if you want to make money, you can make up ancient texts and then you can sell them for money. Do you honestly believe nobody did that? Of course people did that. Abso-freaking-lutely. The con artists were alive and well back during the Renaissance. Believe that. Now, that's our problem. So, Scaliger starts to base all his chronology off an already considered messed up chronology of the Julius calendar, or a timeline. Then he starts using all of these either straight up forgeries, partial forgeries, mixed up forgeries, etc., to then inject and create his own chronology based on the numbers from the Julian system. So we have a problem here. We have somebody who has access to fraudulent works that are being claimed to be true. We have them basing his entire timeline off of a chronological time frame that was also incorrect, the Julian. And he has an ego, and he wants to obviously promote himself. And he does that. So he starts to create this whole timeline, and then that timeline is eventually what it becomes the foundation for all of our history. So whenever we start to compare things back as we go further back in time, that stuff is then compared against Scaligerian timeline, and if it goes against the Scaligerian timeline, it's wrong as far as the mainstream is concerned. You can't do it. If it goes against the Scaligerian timeline in any significant way, it's wrong. It's the same problem that we have when we talk about Egyptian chronology. So the mainstream uses Egyptian chronology. They use this as their Bible for ancient chronology. They believe they have this whole thing mapped out in ancient Egypt. They generally have all the rulers lined up. No problems. We know exactly when everybody was. During whatever reign did whatever during whatever period. They have all this mapped out apparently. And it gets even worse. So we have a corrupt Western institution that is using Scaligerian timeline for more recent stuff, which we now know is based off of fraudulent works, half-truths, etc. And then we go further back in time, and then we start to try to use the Egyptian timeline to fill in the gaps in ancient history, which historians believe they have locked in, and they combine those two to give us the current chronology. Like, if you are a historian and you weren't already laughing your ass off at that, you're failing as a historian. Okay, the mainstream academic outlook on history is absolutely ridiculous. It is one of the stupidest things you can possibly imagine. And it is pushed on the planet like you wouldn't believe. Why would anybody push something as stupid as this to the planet? Well, the more people they have believing the lies, the more control they can gain over everything. Don't forget, if you can control the history, you control everything. You don't believe me? You think that this concept is some weird conspiracy theory? Let's have some fun. I don't know if this is digressing. I'm just going to talk. If you think that nobody would alter the timeline for their own good, you have zero understanding of what a human is. You literally do not understand what humans are. Humans don't give a crap. There are plenty of humans out there that will do the most despicable stuff for even the slightest gain. Right? If you say that's not true, you are objectively stupid. I mean, there's nothing else to say to you. Humans are easily corrupted, and they will do corrupt things to get what they want. Now, we know for a fact, even using Scaligerian garbage, you can even use this to prove it. We know for a fact that writings were used, that altered historical writings were used to vindicate, say, somebody's bloodline or advocacy to a throne. We know that. There's no arguing that. We have that in spades. Right? Historians have no problem talking about, the crown altering, bloodlines and historical texts to get certain other princes or kings or queens in or whatever, and all kinds of periods. Like there are countless examples, but it happened back then. It could never happen right now. If you're a historian that thinks that the current mainstream chronology is correct, kill yourself. All right? You're ridiculous. Obviously, there are people today that are doing the exact same thing that people back then were doing. It's the only difference is that the people who are doing it today have a much greater have infinitely better resources to use to get the message out. Now, before you start going, are you a conspiracy theorist? It has nothing to do with anything like that claim. Why? Because check this out. It doesn't take some huge conspiracy to alter a historical text. Anybody on any level can do this for their own gain, even if it's something as simple as trying to get, free muffins from the bakery, right? They're like, well, I lay claim my caveman ancestor used to bang rocks here, so that means where your bakery is now built, you have to give me free muffins because technically it's my land or whatever the hell, right? Give me free muffins. And that could be the end of it. The dude just wants free muffins. So he produces caveman text to prove that his bloodline used to own land that the bakery is now built on so that he could get free muffins. You can do that. It's that simple. It does not take a grand conspiracy to want to alter a timeline for a purpose. Okay? This is a problem when we study mainstream chronology. When you start to go into mainstream chronology, the first thing you need to do is you need to have an understanding of where the hell all of this came from. So now we know. We now know a large chunk of what the mainstream considers true, is all generated out of nowhere during the Renaissance. There's countless examples. Everything is an example. Even worse, these books back then were literally then being rewritten or copied or created using what was called quote-unquote original sources. And the monks would write the new history, and even at the beginning of these books, the monks would say, we are changing the histories in these books to better line up with what we believe happened in history. They don't even hide it. So if you believe mainstream chronology right now, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt and be like, you need to step away from it. It's time to move on. Mainstream chronology is 100% poison. Now, what do we do with all this? What are the implications of having everything that a society is based on being a literal fabrication and or a lie? I guess it'd be the same thing as fabrication is not necessarily a lie, even though it's used to perpetuate a lie. Yeah, you can fabricate evidence to create a lie to back up a lie that keeps going. Okay. So what do we do with all of this? So we know for a fact, this is not speculation. Factually speaking, our chronology right now is wrong. It's based on lies. It's based on half-truths. It's based on twisted people's perceptions of lies and half-truths. So why is it taught at all? Right? The reality is, an average thinking human should call this BS out for exactly for what it is. It is obvious that something is wrong. Why is it being taught like this? Right? Well, social conditioning is there. Nobody questions it. The problem is, in history, you're not taught to use your critical thinking skills to question historical authority. Yeah, it's historical authority. People, when people come across authority, especially your average person, there is a certain respect for authority psychologically, even if you're against authority. Now, the problem here is that once somebody has a perceived authority, that can snowball. Even worse, if that perceived authority has a foundation of lies that it supports to get what it wants, and it's indoctrinated everybody around it to believe in those lies, then the authority compounds, right? So that's the situation we find ourselves in now. What's really interesting is that the current chronology that we're kind of being taught, or that's being rammed down everybody's throats nowadays, and God help you if you question it, this is all relatively new. This was not like this just 100 years ago. Right? First of all, not everybody was as quote unquote educated as they are today. So back then, people were still relying on traditional stories, little snippets of things here and there. And in all honesty, as far as I can tell, history was only sort of mattered anyway. Right? Everybody, just 100 years ago, just 200 years ago, they had a lot of other things to worry about. There was a lot of other stuff going on in the world around them. And while history might have been interesting, they did not have access to tons and tons of information like we do today. So if you don't have access to historical stuff, if you're not exposed to historical knowledge, then you probably aren't thinking about it too much. On top of everything, if your life, you're just trying to live your life back then, where you actually had to try to survive, you were busy. There were other problems. So what's interesting, even historically, is how history is taught. So in other cultures, they have oral traditions, music traditions, some writing, etc., that would have conveyed their histories. But I guess the reality would be, not everybody on the planet, even Western nations, would have had tons and tons of detail of history. So what that means is that there's nobody there to cross-check things to make sure stuff is accurate. Yeah, here's an interesting point. If information is consolidated into the relative few, let's go back to Scaliger. So if you only have a few people back in the day kind of, focusing on history, relatively speaking to the population at large, then whoever's doing it is going to ultimately win. So if you have somebody like Scaliger who's going out of his way to push whatever he's doing, regardless of if he had an agenda or not. Okay, we won't even go into anything like that. Doesn't matter. The fact is that he did it. He stepped up and did something, whereas the vast majority of the population did not. So as Scaliger writes tons of books based upon the garbage, lies, etc., even though people back during the day would have and did call him out on his BS, doesn't matter, because over the generations, as time marches on, and if not enough people come out and challenge it, and if just the right people start to promote that, that's what gets put into the general zeitgeist. You do not need some sort of massive conspiracy to mess up our chronology. I think that's a good takeaway from this. You don't need a mass conspiracy. You just need the wrong information to survive. How do you like that? You just need the bad information to survive. Because if there's no good information and the only information that exists is the twisted version, what wins? What wins? Right? For us today, we do not have access to, for example, the Library of Alexandria. We don't have it. It was burned to the ground, apparently. So that is a plethora of information that not only we don't have today, but nobody had back then either. Once that was gone, for example, and I'm not saying that was the only thing, but once you lose good information and all that's left is bad information, over time, that bad information becomes the zeitgeist. It becomes the truth. Because once people have nothing else to latch onto, right? If the only thing people technically latch onto is the bad truth, and as people come and go, as they're born and they die, who's going to stop? Who's going to tell you that Scaliger was full of crap? But they're all dead. Right, the people back then who watched this guy write all of this, knowing that he was doing it for wrong purposes, right? Even if he thought his intentions were good, they were objectively wrong. And we'll go into why he's wrong. I wonder if we should do that in this talk. Go crazy here with this. We'll see. Okay. But if that's all that survives, if the only thing that is then grabbed on by a society is the wrong stuff, what else are you going to do? Right? Who's going to bring the truth to you? There's nobody out there telling the truth. Even if the people knew it was false, it doesn't matter. They're dead. People don't understand how powerful death is and how powerful generational wealth is. I don't know, you might understand it nowadays. Look around. You might finally understand generational wealth. And you might finally understand why these people want you to not have kids. I'm not going to get into that, but think about that. It's interesting. And it's relevant to history. It's relevant to history, right? If you don't believe in generational wealth, they do, and they have power, who wins, right? Okay, I digress. So we now live in a particular period of time where Scaligerian chronology is now screamed from the rooftops as absolute fact. You don't question the facts. Now, what do we do with this? How do we deal with this? So the first thing we can do is we can acknowledge that the Scaligerian timeline is wrong. It's wrong. It's based on forgeries. It's based on scripts that came out of nowhere during the Renaissance. This is all highly questionable, and we're going to question it. So let's apply our critical thinking skills to this subject. So let's ask a basic question. Where did Scaliger's sources come from? The answer: a lot of them come in the form of miraculously discovered tomes during the Renaissance. Okay, so our conclusion then has to be, all right, that's weird, but let's look at the tomes that he was basing his stuff off of. Now, when you start looking at a lot of the Renaissance tomes that exist, that suddenly come out of nowhere, as I said earlier, there's a lot of forgeries. There's a lot of forgeries that historians already have no problem saying are forgeries. But what's ironic is a lot of the stuff that some historians will say is a forgery, they call it out. Not all historians are bad, by the way. It's not that anybody's bad. I want to make that there's a lot of people who are just ingrained into their field, and questioning their field means questioning their way of life, and it also means threatening their livelihood. That's how you gain control over somebody. If you can control their livelihood, you can make them do anything. Right? That need to survive as a human. Oh yeah, you can control that. Anyway, that's relevant to history as well, because that happens. All right, anyway. We now have a problem though. If all of those tomes, if all of these works are suddenly miraculously appearing in people's basements, if we have monks copying stuff, telling you that they are making stuff up as they go along to synchronize with a timeline, we can now stop and we can be like, all right, the Scaligerian timeline exists, but let's put it to the side. How many historians have you ever heard say that? Let's put what we know now to the side really quick. Just put it to the side. Does that kill you? No, it does nothing to you. You can literally put the entire current chronology to the side. And now let's start fresh. Fine, Scaliger's got his thing. We now know for a fact that there are problems with it. If we are intellectually honest, there are problems with that timeline. All right, let's move on now. Now where do we go from here? What do we do now? We now have nothing to build on, right? And this is the interesting part. Once you start looking at the Renaissance and you start to get rid of all the forgeries, you start questioning, at the very least, the authenticity of a lot of these documents and books that suddenly appear, you're left with a lot of void. Why? It's funny. In Western society, we very much historically walk around with the sort of an arrogance of understanding, like, nah, we've got it all mapped out. We understand history. It's done. You know, we don't. We don't understand history. And it's obvious we don't understand history. So what do we do with this? How do we get rid of our arrogant approach to history? So the first thing we need to do, and I've discussed this, is we have to get rid of our ego. The ego is what it is. The ego is the number one problem that is going to get in our way when it comes to us trying to find the truth in history. So let's put the ego aside. Let's do a thought experiment. No more ego. Doesn't matter anymore. Let's put it to the side, just for fun. You don't have to tell anybody. All right, you don't need to let anybody know. You can do this in secret. Let's just put all the crap aside. Everything that we know, even for you alt researchers. Let's just put it to the side and let's start questioning things. Now, I'm talking about Scaligerian chronology here in this schizobabble talk, whatever the hell this is. But this is going to matter for any period in history. It matters for your Egyptian timelines that so much garbage is based off of, because that's garbage. Whatever it is. Throw the ego away. Now, our ego's on the side. It's on the side, right? You put your ego to the side. You can control your ego, right? You don't let your ego control you. You're not that weak, are you? You're not so weak that your ego controls you. Yeah. Put the ego aside. Our ego's aside. Now what? All right. First, let's go back to his time period. He's doing this in the late 1500s. Scaliger's writing all this stuff down. All right, so he's almost 500 years-ish away from us. Half a century almost. So what was his life like back then? So he's obviously closer to historical events than we are now. That's thing one. You may think that is obvious, but this matters to think about. Right, people just don't care about time, man. They just think they have this grasp on everything, and they say the word hundreds or thousands or millions of years like it's nothing. Like they have a complete understanding of what they're saying and the weight of those years. I cannot stress how unbelievably stupid that is. There are people nowadays that will talk like they know everything that happened just 100 years ago. I promise you, if you took a time machine and you went back to that time period that person is talking about, you would be floored about how wrong he was. Why? Because it is impossible to convey the true amount of information of what was going on during a period forward in time. Even nowadays, check this out, just to prove this point. Let's just say somebody 100 years from now wants to say exactly how life was like now. So what year is 2023? So in 2123, someone's like, I'm an expert on the year 2023. How accurate can that person be? So the first thing you can say is, hey, look, we have all kinds of telemetry data on the population of the planet. If you can access that, let's just pretend you have access to that stuff. You will have literally bajillions of hours of voices, recordings for all kinds of people. Pictures of everything. You'll have pictures of so much stuff. Video. You will have a wealth of information about what it was like today. And it's pretty good. It's not bad, especially relative to what we know of just 100 years ago from this period of time. Right? So 100 years ago from 2023, so in 1923, so we have some pictures. We have a little bit of video here and there, black and white, all black and white. We can colorize it. Some recordings. We have stuff. We even have physical stuff still, right? But do you honestly feel that you can truly explain what people were living like and what history was like back then during a time period to where not a single person is alive to convey it? The answer is no. The answer is no. Even with the amount of information that somebody in 2123 would have on us right now, they would still miss tons of nuances of what was going on during our periods of time. They would never understand what all of us are feeling internally. Even if a lot of us wrote it out, doesn't matter. They will never have a true grasp on what's going on emotionally and intellectually internally within everybody. That matters because that is what's creating the culture around everybody. That is what creates the minute details. Those minute details then build up to create a very unique instance in time. if somebody in 2023 is going to have a difficulty understanding what's going on now, there'd be a lot of stuff that even though they may think they have a grasp on, they've seen it, they've heard it, it's right there, they have a ton of information, they would probably be blown away when they come back to see what people were actually like. So take that, now let's go back 100 years from our period of time. People back then didn't have anything of the stuff that we have now. Their lives are completely different. But historians will talk about 100 years ago like it's easy to comprehend. Like we understand those freaking monkeys like they're nothing, right? Isn't that funny? Like the further back in time you go, the more stupid our ancestors are. Like that's ridiculous. But that is the outlook that historians have when you go back in history. Historians never give our ancestors credit. Nobody gets credit for anything in the past. It is hilarious. Everybody before the current historian was born was like a literal caveman as far as they're concerned. Everything they did was backwards. Everything they did was nowhere near as good as we do it now. All complete garbage. So this is our problem when we start to try to figure out history. So let's get back to Scaliger. Right, yeah, you thought I was gone. You thought I wouldn't come back to this? No, we got it. Scaliger. So in Scaliger's period of time, he's doing this in the late 1500s. Are you going to make a claim that you understand the late 1500s, what he was truly like, what his peers were like, what his lifestyle was like, his day-to-day life, what was truly influencing what? Do you honestly believe you have... Does any historian have a true grasp on what was going on back then? The answer is no. It's not possible. It is impossible. We do not know. To make matters worse, for the historians, is the chronology they base their stuff on is also messed up. It's objectively messed up. So whatever these people try to show you, even if they try to show you evidence to support whatever it is they're thinking, they're probably still missing the point entirely. Right? The further back we go, the less stuff we have. So that means we will never have a truly high level of understanding of a historical event. Which means that it's easy to alter and change things, which means as time passes, you can convey whatever message you want at the end of the day. This is important to remember. So the Scaligerian timeline, Scaliger, his psychological mindset, it could be something as simple as greed. It could be something as simple as ego. And I think in some cases it was. But do I know that for a fact? I do not. For all I know, how do you like this? For all I know, people are demonizing Scaliger because maybe Scaliger wrote something else that was legit, but they had to get rid of him. Now that happens in history too. Now I'm not saying that's what happened. That's a thought experiment. Think about it. But ultimately, we can't understand what the people back then who were beginning to correlate our current history, what they were doing, why they were doing it, and how they were doing it, and the mentality they were doing it with on a true level. Not having that true understanding is a huge deficit that we will always have in historical studies. It's important to keep this in mind. Right? Understanding the nuances of what humans were doing back then. I don't care who, it doesn't matter the time period, the culture, whatever, it doesn't matter. Those people were living people. They had lives, thoughts, they did stuff. You do stuff every day, right? You don't think about it. These people were doing stuff every day too. This stuff every day is what is forming their lives. And there's stuff there that is not recorded that would have absolutely impacted overall history. So you say I'm rambling. Yes. Yes. There's so many problems with this. The main point of this talk, now that I've been mumbling about garbage for almost an hour. You like that? You still with me? Wow, get a life. Talking about this crap for forever. What's the point of all of this? Ultimately, the point is to understand whenever you're studying history, make sure you are keeping a level head with respect to where your foundation is coming from. So, if you're using Scaligerian history as a foundation for something you're studying, you're in a bad position. People don't want to admit that they are in a bad position. I mean, who wants to admit that their life's work is based on fraud? So you buy into the sunk cost fallacy, I suppose. Don't do that. This is where gaining control of your ego will pay off. So gain control of your ego immediately. I've made a talk on this. I'll probably make another one when I'm better at doing this. Do not let your ego control your outcomes. If something is wrong, for example, if any of your stuff is based on a Scaligerian historiography, chronology, whatever, if you have any of your stuff based off of him, you objectively, scientifically have problems. And there's nothing else that's going to save you. Right? There's no excuses. There's no way that you can use Scaliger as a 100% foolproof foundation for anything you do. It's not possible. So don't forget that. So when you start doing history, what I would tell you is just get rid of the Scaligerian timeline. That's the point of this entire talk. How do you like that? The whole point of all of this, get rid of Scaligerian timeline. Once you push that to the side, then you can start using critical thinking against the real problems in history. Now, for those of you who this thought scares the crap out of you, here's the positive side to this. Once you get rid of the Scaligerian chronology, basically get rid of the mainstream timeline. Get rid of the whole Egyptian timeline. Get rid of the Roman timeline in the mainstream backed up by Scaligerian chronology. Once you get rid of all of that, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Because I think that's also one of the problems. Not that I know. People get scared of that because that is literally you now jumping into the unknown. Because now you have nothing to grab onto. Right? People can use the Scaligerian timeline as a crutch. Once you get rid of that, where's your crutch? Because you are absolutely broken. As historians, we are absolutely broken. We are missing pieces of ourselves. All right? That's kind of the point of history, is to find those pieces to the best of our ability. The Scaligerian timeline is one hell of a crutch. Once you get rid of that crutch, suddenly you're out there floating on your own. You have to walk on your own. And that scares people. I'm here to tell you, don't be afraid of that. Why? Because here's what happens when you get rid of the Scaligerian timeline. Once that's gone, you are free. So I use the term crutch. People use it as a crutch. It's not even a crutch. They are chains that keep you in a cell. Once you undo those chains, the Scaligerian chains, not only do your chains come off, but the door to your cell opens up. And yeah, guess what? It's going to be different outside of your cell. All right? Yes, things are incredibly different than what you've been taught. But you can now use your skills that you've built up over your life to now start finding and making real discoveries. Finding real truth that actually matters. Truth that will fulfill you and everyone around you. That's the important part. Find the truth. You will never find truth wearing shackles. You will never do it. It's never going to happen. So go gain control of your ego. Get rid of the Scaligerian timeline. And then start doing real history. Start employing your critical thinking skills now against stuff like the Scaligerian timeline. Look at the Scaligerian timeline as if it's the enemy. It's not going to take very long for you to see how absolutely poisonous it is. Now, I've gone over the poison here in this talk very briefly, right? Just go do your own research relative to where Scaliger existed, where he got his sources from, who he was as a person as far as we can tell, and analyze that period of time. And it's not just Scaliger, right? Like I said, you have monks rewriting books as well at this point in time. And what makes things even funnier is once you start to apply your critical thinking skills against these people, you start to see all the fraud pop up instantly. You can ask a simple question like, why am I taught a history that was written by a monk when the monk literally says in the beginning of the book that he's changing history to match what they want to have? Oh, and by the way, all the original texts that this monk was using mystically burned up in a fire. But only the original texts. That's the other thing. Only original texts seem to disappear during this time period as well. If there were any original texts during the 1500s, 1400s, which there probably were. That was 500 years ago. I have no doubt that there were original real texts back then to some degree or another. There were. But the problem is that we find fires happening all the time, only burning the originals. Now, if that doesn't raise an eyebrow in you, you're not paying attention. Wake up. You need to wake up. Go slap yourself. I don't care. Do something, because that sentence in and of itself is enough for you to doubt everything you know. So don't adhere to the Scaligerian chronology. I think that's the point of this, whatever the hell this is. What else? Alright, so just go find truth. I'm going to cut it here because this is too long. Get rid of the Scaligerian. Okay, here's the takeaway, if you're still here. Here's the takeaway. Get rid of Scaligerian chronology. I also recommend getting rid of basically any mainstream chronology that tries to act like it has some form or another of main authority. That also includes like the Egyptian timeline, the Roman timeline, which is Scaligerian based anyway, Greece. Like the king's lists in Egypt, there's lots of problems there. I'll do a different show on that. I'll do a different show on the... I'll talk crap about that later, the Egyptian stuff later. But even if you don't hear that, get rid of these timelines. Get rid of the mainstream stuff. If you have a problem, like instantly if you think about this, if you're not able to stomach getting rid of the mainstream timelines just by me saying it, like you can technically do this. Right now, if I say get rid of the mainstream timeline and go do your own thing, in theory, you as a human can make the choice to do that. You have the choice. You have the power on whatever you want to do technically. Right? A lot of people forget that. You do not have to go and do whatever the hell some professor says. You do not have to believe whatever the History Channel tells you, right? You do not have to believe what's shown to you on whatever social media you waste your time on. You don't have to. A lot of people think that they do because they perceive those figures as authoritative. Stop that. You can do that. So for those of you who can make that decision right now, great, fantastic, you're already ahead of the game. For those of you who thought about it and became scared, or the defensiveness came up, how do I get you out of that? Here's what you need to do. Do me a favor. If you're afraid of relinquishing the mainstream chronology, do this. Take the critical thinking skills that hopefully you are working on anyway, and if you're not, I've already talked about that. Go watch that crap. Use critical thinking skills against the belief system of the mainstream. Employ scientific reasoning, critical thinking against what you believe. Now, if you consider yourself a true academic and that you're above everything, but you can't do that, then people can call you objectively corrupt and objectively wrong. And that means nobody has to listen to you either. Now, a lot of this is probably hard to hear and hard to think about. So I recommend going and doing critical thinking exercises. Simple things like just ask a simple question against something you already believe. In this case, we're focused on chronology. Go ask yourself basic questions about facts that maybe you've never thought there was any indisputable fact. Just do it for fun. This is a great mental exercise anyway, but it's something we should be doing always. It shouldn't be an exercise that you do like once in a blue moon. It actually should be part of everything you do when you do your historical studies. Constantly. This never ends, by the way. You don't do it once and then you're done. No, you keep doing it. Like I said, it goes on forever because that is how we filter all the garbage out. Right? We stay intellectually honest, using critical thinking skills, asking proper questions, and changing our outcomes as demanded by the answers we get using our critical thinking skills and employing scientific methods. Never forget, your job as a historical researcher is the discovery of the truth and nothing else. I'm not interested in anything else other than the truth. And neither is anybody else at the end of the day. So get rid of the Scaligerian timeline. Let it go. Just let it go. Just let it go. Who cares? You have the power to let that trash go. Just do it. Just get rid of it. Once you get rid of the Scaligerian timeline, then start going back to your research. You're going to be surprised about what you're going to find. Now, for those of you who are already doing that and for some reason stuck around here, good job. Not only did you get to hear my insanity, but you also got reminded that you are also already on the right track. Keep going. Done with this talk. Go find the truth. I'm not interested in anything else other than that.